Yeah is Australia's education service on AIDS with a strategic focus on young people. Essentially, that means making sure that young Australians know what AIDS is and believe they can do something about it. I think by Kevin coming to Australia, he's able to put a human face to the devastation that we hear about AIDS orphans, young people that have lost the opportunity to grow up in supportive home environments because of the impact and devastation of AIDS. And Kevin is a story about life. Kevin has survived that ordeal and can share with people, in a really personal way, what it's been like to go through that in a way that you just can't get from just reading about it, or it's that first-hand sort of connection. AIDS has so many repercussions in our world, and it has repercussions in it's like that ripple effect. You're right, it's not just the person that contracts HIV, it doesn't stop there. That ripple effect actually it continues to go out throughout the whole community, and first of all it starts in that sort of nucleus of a family. When somebody contracts HIV, the next people affected by that are their loved ones and their family and their friends. And then beyond that, you see the impacts, especially in areas where HIV has become so prevalent. You see the broader impacts it has on communities, and it perpetuates issues such as poverty, as people aren't able to work, and it just sort of goes on and on and on. And yet the thing that I continually struggle to understand about this is that for more than a decade, we have had all of the information we have needed to know how to prevent this disease. And yet, look at the impact it's still having on every corner of this globe. Why do we lack the capacity to put that into action? Stigma is one of the biggest things fueling the spread of AIDS globally. The misconception of understanding what AIDS really is. It's not as easy as just saying, don't do this or don't do that, when it comes to sex or drugs or some of these issues that, we traditionally have such a tough time talking about, but they're actually real parts of our society and real parts of our world. AIDS has been around for 26 years. Roughly, if you say that's sort of the definition of youth, people under that age bracket, they've been born into a world with AIDS, yet they're not being educated about it, and they're going to be left to try to respond to this issue. So what is the rest of society doing to equip young people with the knowledge and the opportunity to do something about it? On one hand, we've had the positive breakthrough of better treatments, enabling people to live longer lives and an improvement of quality of life to a degree. Having grown up in a family affected by HIV, it's not something you would wish on anybody to experience. It's not the sort of thing that you can say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter if I contract HIV, I can manage this. My connection with HIV began 19 years ago. As a young girl, my mum was diagnosed with HIV. She'd actually had it for several years and wasn't aware, which was pretty common and still often is quite common. HIV is one of those things, you don't wake up the day after contracting it and, sort of have this tattoo on your forehead telling you that. So often it can take several years, particularly if you're a healthy person to begin with, before you start to see maybe any signs or symptoms. And in my mum's case, which is a common situation for women, she had actually fallen pregnant. And often in routine pregnancy tests here in Australia, doctors will ask the question, and take a history and say, is there a reason we should do a HIV test? And in my mum's case, she discovered she was HIV positive. It was actually blurted out to me in a not so pleasant way, that your mum's got AIDS, she's going to die. And given the context of the time, I actually thought that meant she would die then and there. Mum and I then went on a bit of a journey together to try to learn and figure out what it actually meant. to have HIV in 1989. And I think, I was very fortunate to have a mum that had that type of attitude towards it, and that's more her capacity as the person she was, that she was a very open sort of a person, and by setting that example for me, she made me feel reassured that it was okay, that we could figure out what this was about and find out the best way to deal with it. It's like living with a ticking time bomb, and by the age of 13, my mum had already experienced what we used to, I guess, call AIDS-defining illnesses. So it was a time when we thought, okay, this is the beginning of the end. And like a lot of long-term survivors, mum was sort of at that forefront. So doctors really didn't know much more than we knew back then. They were learning from these patients to see how they were responding to those early treatments. And my mum managed to bounce back several times. But towards the end of high school, it was becoming pretty obvious that her body was unable to take the continuous sort of beating of a broken immune system that left her vulnerable to everything else. And she'd battled cancer that had gone into remission. She'd lost her eyesight. She'd had numerous other infections. And although her spirit kept fighting strong, her body was wearing out. And shortly after I finished Year 12, Mum passed away. And she'd been battling with it for 15 years. I think also what I've learnt from, meeting Kevin, and, I've met many other people from a range of countries and cultures and different backgrounds, is that, it's not about how someone gets HIV or, where it comes from or those sorts of things. It's the fact that, if you've experienced this, everyone living with HIV is in the same boat. People affected by HIV, where the repercussions of society's inability to say, AIDS is real and let's deal with it. So that's the place in which we sort of connect. But then the other side of that is how different our lives are, even though we've experienced very similar things. The sheer fact that I grew up in sort of middle-class white Australia versus growing up in a rural area of a country in Africa meant that I had a lot more opportunities in life, despite the fact that I was growing up in a family affected by AIDS. And, people growing up in other areas don't. And we've got to stop letting things like our geographical boundaries, dictate the level of opportunity a person has to life. Australia needed a service like Youth Empowerment Against HIV to take the message out there to schools, to parents, and to young people themselves, to raise the issue with the media and equip young people with knowledge and information so they can do something about AIDS.